One final question, Dr. Ravi. I mean, because we were talking about the common minimum program, I also just want to stress it does, and I quote, Sri Lanka should join the base erosion and profit shifting BEPS framework. And they've also mentioned a progressive corporate tax regime without sharp discontinuity. So that's just to be fair to the common minimum program. But on the subject of SOEs, so this is the next...
I think a 15% tax rate,
yes.
I think. Yeah, so
yes.
I think the...
But that's the BEPS, isn't it?
We should have a minimum tax rate. The previous government had rejected that. One of the few holdouts in the world rejecting that global tax treaty.
Right.
So I think we definitely should join it, but I think we need much higher tax rates on everything. And I don't think 15% is not enough. I mean, we need to triple corporate tax collection as a share of GDP to get back to where we are in relation to our peers. This is not going to do it.
On the subject of SOEs, the Common Minimum Program mentions, and I quote, privatizing SOEs through private-public partnerships, liberalize industries where SOEs operate. So how do you see that dynamic? Now, if you take the two large SOEs, the CPC and the Ceylon Electricity Board, how do you see the privatization debate? I mean, from the point of view of electricity prices, energy prices in general, and if we're saying no subsidy for, say, petrol or no subsidy for electricity, is the country going to develop when you've got such a high rate for energy and incomes are roughly the same? I mean, you at least have to subsidize energy and manufacturing. So how do you see the debate on the SOEs? I mean, it seems...
So I think that there's some conflation there of separate problems.
Right.
And there is some really woolly-headed thinking about strategy and sequencing. Okay. And the fact that they spend so much time in the Common Minimum Program document focusing on this tells me it's a bit woolly-headed, frankly. Okay. Now, what are my concerns? First of all, there is a separate problem. The CEB and the CPC are a significant drain on public resources. There's a huge amount of implicit debt because they're essentially borrowing to provide these things, right? But that's not, I don't think, a problem of the fact that they're state-owned enterprises.
Right.
That goes back to a problem of pricing, political pricing set by cabinet and the politicians.
Right.
So in a situation where CEB cannot set its output price independently, like any private company would, it's regulated essentially by the political space. In a situation where the CEB can't make the investments in infrastructure, in power generation that it needs to based on its technical analysis because it's constantly overridden by the political authority. And this has been going on since President Premadasa's time. So the CEB used to have a very well done least cost generation plan. That said, back in the 90s, build a coal plant. Well, successive presidents vetoed it. We went for much more expensive thermal power, right? So I mean, we cannot say this is simply inefficiency in the CEB. So I think we need market-based pricing, and I think that's what the IMF is saying.
Yes.
If you do that, you will reduce the implicit fiscal deficit substantially.
Right.
Now, the question you then raise is, what about the effects on poor people? What about the effects on industry? I think there are two separate issues there. I think the effects on poor people, yes, I mean, I think given the transition that we're going to go through a very hard time, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, we have to shield the poor as much as we can. That's what the IMF is asking us to do.
Exactly.
Right? So I'm not being contrarian here. So I think we need various ways. I think, and to be honestly, there's a proposal by the regulator that they want to revise prices, and I thought it was crazy because they raised the prices more for the low users.
Yes, I saw that, yeah.
Who are more likely to be poor.
Yeah, it was regressive.
So, this is where maybe they were doing their job because they were operating within the parameters set for them by Parliament, but then Parliament should intervene. They should say, well, at least as a transitional matter, because we don't have a good way to protect the poor, at least leave these low users, leave them. And if you have to you go to market-based pricing where essentially you don't make a loss, well then there's an obvious solution. Raise the prices on the high users, on the high-using households, right? People like me. Force me to pay even higher than the production cost, essentially cross-subsidize support. So there are ways we can handle that, right?
Okay.
Now the other issue about the effect on economic development, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we do need market-based pricing.
Right.
I mean, we don't have a competitive export sector if it's simply based on subsidized energy inputs.
Right.
We could do that, if we're a petro economy and have gas gushing out of the ground. We don't have gas and oil gushing out of the ground. And we don't have the fiscal resources to subsidize it. So given that we want a competitive export sector, I think they should be made to face the market price. But what we do need to do is to allow the people who run the CB to come up with a more efficient production plan, because that's what the politicians have prevented them from implementing for 30 years.
All right, okay.
So deal with that. If I may comment on the other privatization aspect.
Yeah.
So I think some of this is just a bit crazy, some of this thinking, right? And the fact that they focused on it, right? And let me give you some background. I mean, you can probably tell from my accent. I sort of grew up, was educated in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah. And I lived through the Margaret Thatcher administration.
Right, okay.
The Margaret Thatcher administration was the British government which established this global fad for privatization.
Yeah.
All the privatization ever since, it goes back to what Margaret Thatcher did. And I will tell you, on screen, I voted for Margaret Thatcher. I think she was a great, competent economic manager. I supported her privatization program. I even bought shares in some of her programs, right?
Okay.
In some of those companies when they were peopleized, as President Premadas would say, peopleized, not sold to other companies, but put on the stock exchange, right? But there's a huge difference between the Margaret Thatcher privatization program and what these guys are talking about. What these guys are talking about is more akin to the sell-off after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which not only left Russia as a dysfunctional economy, dysfunctional society, which did not improve its competitiveness to a large extent, but it also left it with a huge political problem with oligarchs.
Oligarchies, yeah.
Right? And so and I'll tell you what some of the key differences. Something that people don't appreciate about Margaret Thatcher. Yes, she privatized. But she should also be known for one other thing. She was the best manager of state-owned enterprises in public ownership of all British prime ministers. She took those SOEs which were loss-making and made them profitable under government control. And then she privatized. So her privatization strategy was first fix the company, then float it.
So that the state gets something back, because otherwise you're giving them something.
You're not flogging off the family silver. She cleaned it up, she polished it, made it look more beautiful, and then sold it. She was acting in the public interest, right? And there's another part to this, especially when you talk about CB and CBC, some of these important markets which need regulation in the public interest. Regulation is hard to do. It requires a high level of state capacity. So what the Thatcher administration demonstrated was they had the state capacity to run the industry first well, and then they set up the regulated capacity. I find it a very hard stretch to say a state that cannot demonstrate basic management of these SOEs under government ownership is fit or able to do effective regulation, because that's much harder actually, right? So I think this is really quite screwed up, right? I mean, I am proud, and I say I voted for Margaret Thatcher, and I support her privatization program, which got us to this discussion. What these guys are suggesting is not that. They have no idea, right? And I'll give you just one example of Sri Lankan Airlines. It was a failure, the privatization, on many respects. First of all, it was reversed, which means it ignored the underlying political economy.
Right.
Secondly, it wasn't even privatized. You know, British Airways, Margaret Thatcher sold it on the stock market. What did we do? We sold it to another state enterprise. Not even a quoted state enterprise, right? It was not a PLC or whatever. It was Emirates, which is owned essentially by the Emirati, by the
the royal family.
The royal family. Doesn't publish its accounts properly, right? That's number one. Second, I'm a great believer in markets, but you need regulation, right? So in the airline industry, which is highly regulated, we have competition authorities. Competition authorities are very concerned about what airlines do in developed, rich countries. Yeah. Do you know what? The privatization previous of Sri Lankan Airlines would not have got through any competition authority in any of the advanced capitalist economies. They would have said, this is ridiculous. You're selling the airline to its major competitor, right? You're selling it, our major traffic route was to the Gulf. These two airlines together now control 90% of the seat capacity. You know what they would have said? Okay, if you want to do this, they would have told the government, if you're going to do this, oh, you have to force Emirates and Sri Lankan Airlines to give up 50% of their seat capacity on the most profitable routes, right? And so this is like a crazy, people didn't think this through. And then I would just add, people say, oh, but under Emirates they make profits. You look at their accounts. Sri Lankan Airlines did not make profits on the passenger component.
Oh, the other thing, yeah.
They made it on
Ground
the
handling.
ground handling, where the Emirates Airlines was given a monopoly by the state. Now, how do you explain to me how a state monopoly, a company which makes profits from a state monopoly, is demonstrating to you the superiority of market-based companies? I don't understand this, right? And then they transferred a lot of the capacity. So I think Sri Lankan Airlines lost its ticketing division. They even took our frequent flyer program, which is now the Emirates frequent flyer program, believe it or not. They took the ability to set prices. They took the computer systems and they took it to Dubai. They decapitated the airline. That wasn't developing the airline. And they did transfer pricing. So the Emirates are not stupid. I mean, I think they could live with a loss-making Sri Lankan airline operation, because what they were doing was transferring our passengers to the Dubai to take the more profitable routes. I think all these things could be foreseen. The problem is we had no regulatory capacity, no government capacity to manage or to expect that, and that goes back to the problem. We shouldn't privatize when we haven't thought through the state capacity issues that it raises.